She paid for his groceries without a word. He returned the favor years later. He stood frozen at the checkout line, his hands gripping the handles of two overfilled grocery bags, his face flushing red as the cashier repeated the same words he dreaded to hear. "I'm sorry, your card has been declined. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel." The people behind him shifted impatiently. A mother with two small children sighed loudly. Another man rolled his eyes and glanced at his watch. He could feel the heat of their stares on the back of his neck. His stomach churned with embarrassment. All he wanted was to grab the bags and leave, but the numbers on the screen glared at him, reminding him of how little he had. He reached for the items one by one, his voice low as he muttered, "Take this off." And this too. He set aside the carton of milk, then the loaf of bread, then the small pack of chicken that he had planned to stretch into meals for the week. Each removal cut deeper. He knew he couldn't afford all of it, but he hated admitting it in front of strangers. The cashier gave him a polite smile, but even that felt pitying. His chest tightened. He thought of how carefully he had budgeted, how he had counted every coin before coming. Still, it wasn't enough. Life had a way of reminding him, again and again, how little control he had. He glanced at the dwindling pile of groceries. Soon there would be nothing left worth buying. His pride burned. He wanted to disappear. And then, without warning, he heard a voice, calm, firm, and gentle. "It's all right. I've got this." He turned his head, confused. Standing just behind him was a woman, maybe in her 30s, her hair tied back neatly, her expression steady and kind. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't hesitate. She simply stepped forward, handed her card to the cashier, and said, "Please, put it all through." The young man blinked in shock. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He couldn't believe what was happening. The cashier's eyebrows lifted slightly but quickly rang everything back up. The line began to move again. The woman stood silently, her arms crossed loosely, as if this was the most ordinary thing in the world. When the final total flashed on the screen, she nodded, took her receipt, and looked at him briefly. He searched her eyes for some clue, some explanation. Why would she help him? Why would she spend her own money on a stranger? But she didn't explain. She just gave him the smallest smile and said softly, "Take care of yourself." Then she walked away, her footsteps fading down the aisle. He stood there, stunned. His hands trembled as the cashier pushed the bags toward him. The line had already moved on, the next customer unloading their items, the impatience forgotten. But for him, the moment stretched endlessly. He wanted to run after her, to thank her, to somehow repay what she had done. But by the time he gathered himself, she was gone. Just like that. Carrying the groceries felt heavier than usual, not because of their weight, but because of what they now meant. Each item in the bag wasn't just food. It was proof that someone, a complete stranger, had chosen to step in when he needed it most. As he walked home, the sound of her words echoed in his mind. Take care of yourself. They weren't just casual. They felt deliberate, almost like a charge, a responsibility. He promised himself something then. One day, if he ever found himself in a better position, if life ever gave him the chance, he would do the same for someone else. He would step in, without questions, without expecting thanks. The sting of shame began to ease, replaced by something else. Gratitude, quiet and humbling. That day at the checkout line was not just about groceries. It was the beginning of a vow, one he never forgot. He replayed the scene in his head again and again, like a movie that refused to end. The sound of the cashier's voice, the humiliation of his empty wallet, the sudden shift when she stepped forward. It had all happened so quickly, but it had changed everything. He didn't even know her name. That unsettled him the most. She had appeared, paid without hesitation, and vanished like a shadow before he could catch his breath. No name, no details, no way to repay her. All he had was the memory of her voice, the way she looked at him, not with pity, but with simple kindness. That night, he placed the groceries on his small kitchen table. He touched the carton of milk she had paid for, then the bread, then the chicken. Ordinary things. Yet each one carried weight now. Each one reminded him that, in his worst moment, someone had stepped in. As he ate, he thought about what it must have cost her. Maybe it wasn't much for her, maybe it was. He would never know. What he did know was that she didn't hesitate, didn't pause to wonder if he was worthy. She didn't judge the clothes he wore or the way he stood there fumbling with his card. She had seen a need and filled it. The next day, he went back to the store around the same time, hoping he might see her again. He wandered through the aisles, pretending to shop, his eyes scanning faces. But she wasn't there. Day after day, he tried again. He even asked one of the cashiers, describing her, but they shrugged. People came and went. No one remembered her. Slowly, it sank in. He might never see her again. At first, that thought stung. He wanted the chance to say thank you. But as days turned into weeks, something inside him shifted. Maybe that was the point. She hadn't helped him to be thanked. She had done it because she could, because it was the right thing. He thought about how quiet her act had been. No announcement, no grand gesture, just a card handed over and a simple smile. She had given him dignity when he was about to lose it. From then on, whenever he walked into a grocery store, he noticed things he had never paid attention to before. The tired parents counting coins at the register. The older man putting back a bag of rice because it was just a little too much. The teenager looking nervous as the total climbed higher than what was in his pocket. He noticed because he had been there, and because she had noticed him. He didn't have the means to step in yet. His own money was still tight, every paycheck stretched thin. But he carried the promise inside him like a seed waiting to grow. Someday, when the time was right, he would act the same way she had. One evening, as he sat in his small apartment, he wrote down the moment in a notebook he kept by his bed. He wrote the words she had said. Take care of yourself. It became more than advice. It became a reminder. A stranger had cared enough to tell him that. Now he would carry it forward. Her face blurred in his memory over time, but the feeling never left. The moment at the checkout line became a turning point, something that shaped the way he looked at the world. He realized that even the smallest act of kindness could ripple outward, touching lives in ways that went unseen. She would never know how much her gesture meant, how it fueled him to push harder, to hold on, to keep believing that good people still existed. And though he couldn't repay her directly, he decided he would keep her gift alive in the only way that mattered, by passing it on someday, to someone else who needed it, just as badly as he once did. The grocery bags were long gone, but the weight of that moment never left him. Weeks turned into months, and still he found himself thinking about her. He remembered the way she had stepped forward without hesitation, the way she spoke as though it was the most natural thing in the world to help someone. That act of kindness had carved itself into his memory. He wasn't just grateful, he was determined. Determined that when life gave him the chance, he would return the favor. Maybe not to her, because he knew the odds of seeing her again were slim, but to someone else who needed it. Someone who found themselves standing at the edge of humiliation the way he once had. Every time he opened his wallet, he thought of her. Every time he made a budget, cut corners, or scraped together change, he remembered that day. It didn't make his own struggles disappear, but it gave them a different shape. It reminded him that people were watching, even when you thought you were invisible. He started pushing himself harder. He picked up extra shifts, took odd jobs, stayed up late studying. He told himself he couldn't waste the chance she had given him. That one moment of compassion felt like an investment in him, and he didn't want to let it go to waste. When he doubted himself, when exhaustion tempted him to give up, he replayed it in his mind. The sound of her voice, steady and calm. The look in her eyes, kind but firm. The way she walked away without asking for thanks. It fueled him in ways nothing else could. He made a quiet vow. One day, he would not only stand on his own 2 feet, but be in a position to do the same for someone else. It wasn't just about groceries anymore. It was about dignity. It was about hope. That woman had given him both when he had none. Years began to pass. Slowly, his efforts paid off. He managed to finish his courses. He landed a job. Not glamorous, not perfect, but steady. The kind of job that came with regular hours and a reliable paycheck. He rented a slightly bigger place, bought his own furniture instead of relying on what was left behind. Still, the memory of her never faded. It was there in the back of his mind like a guiding light. Whenever he saw someone struggling, he thought of her. When he passed by a family counting change at the register, he felt the pull in his chest. Not yet, he'd tell himself, but soon. On the nights when he allowed himself to think about the future, he imagined that moment. He imagined himself stepping forward the way she did, calm and confident. He imagined handing over his card without hesitation. And he imagined the look on the other person's face, the same mixture of shock and relief that he once carried. But more than anything, he imagined how it would feel to finally complete the circle, to take the gift she had given him and put it back into the world. Her voice never left him. Take care of yourself. Simple words. But to him, they had become a mission. He didn't know when it would happen. He didn't know where. But he carried the promise everywhere he went. That vow became his anchor. It kept him moving forward. It kept him believing. And it reminded him that sometimes the smallest moments can shape an entire lifetime. He was no longer the young man frozen at the register, paralyzed by shame. He was someone who had been lifted, someone who would someday be ready to lift someone else. The day would come, he knew, and when it did, he would be ready. The years rolled forward, each one stacking quietly on top of the last. He wasn't rich, not by any stretch, but he was no longer living day to day, terrified of what might happen at the checkout counter. The memory of that humiliating afternoon and the kindness that followed still lived inside him, but now it worked like fuel instead of shame. He had finished his schooling with more effort than he thought possible. There were nights he almost quit, nights when exhaustion seemed heavier than hope. But every time he thought about walking away, he remembered her. The way she paid without hesitation, the way she left without looking for thanks. He told himself she hadn't just paid for groceries. She had paid for the belief that he was worth investing in. That memory kept him moving when nothing else did. With a steady job now, he was building a life that finally felt stable. His paychecks weren't big, but they were consistent. He could plan. He could save. He could even allow himself small comforts, a meal out once in a while, a pair of shoes that didn't pinch at the toes. Each small step felt like a victory. But the vow never left him. Every time he saw someone struggling, the urge returned. The man standing in line counting out coins. The mother quietly telling the cashier to put the cereal back. The teenager pretending not to care as they handed over crumpled bills that didn't quite add up. Each scene pulled at him, reminded him of that day when his own chest burned with the same shame. Still, he wasn't ready yet. He had responsibilities of his own. Rent to pay, debts to cover. He knew stepping forward too soon would only drag him back into the same cycle he had fought so hard to escape. So he waited. He worked. He kept building. And in the background, the vow became something deeper. It wasn't just about paying for someone's groceries. It was about becoming the kind of person she had been for him. Quiet, steady, compassionate. Someone who helped because they could, not because they wanted credit. That thought shaped the way he carried himself. At work, he stayed late when others needed help. In his neighborhood, he watched out for the older residents, offering to carry their bags upstairs. These weren't grand gestures, but each one felt like practice for the promise he had made. He sometimes wondered what had driven her to act that day. Was she well off, and it meant little to her? Or had she sacrificed something herself to cover his bill? He would never know. But he hoped it had been easy for her, that it hadn't caused her stress. And he told himself that one day he wanted to be in a place where helping someone else would come as naturally to him as it had seemed to come to her. Life settled into a rhythm. Work, pay bills, cook, sleep, repeat. And yet, the vow never dulled. It wasn't just a fleeting promise from a moment of gratitude. It was a seed that had taken root in him, growing stronger with time. And though he didn't know it yet, the moment when he would finally act, the moment when the circle would close, was much closer than he ever imagined. For years, he had prepared silently, carrying that weight inside. Soon, life would place him back at a checkout line, standing behind someone in need. And this time, he would not freeze. He would not hesitate. This time, he would be ready to do what he had promised all along. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind where nothing feels significant until it suddenly is. He had stopped at the grocery store after work, tired but content. His cart was filled with the basics: bread, milk, some vegetables, a few things for the week ahead. He moved through the aisles without thinking much, almost on autopilot, until he reached the checkout line. At first, it seemed like any other day. He unloaded his items onto the conveyor belt, scrolling absent-mindedly through his phone while he waited. Then he noticed the woman in front of him. She looked older, maybe late 60s or early 70s, her hands shaking slightly as she placed items on the belt. Her cart wasn't overflowing, just a few essentials: a bag of rice, a carton of eggs, some canned goods, and fresh fruit. He watched as she pulled out a stack of coupons, carefully sorting through them. The cashier scanned each one, but the total still stood higher than what she could manage. He could see it in her face, the quiet panic, the way her lips pressed tightly together. "I'm sorry," the cashier said gently. "That brings it to $34.72. The woman reached into her purse, her fingers fumbling through coins and small bills. She counted once, then again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I have enough." The line behind them grew restless. A man sighed loudly. Someone muttered under their breath. The old woman lowered her eyes, pulling items back toward herself. First the fruit, then the eggs. She hesitated over the rice, as if deciding what she could live without. His chest tightened. The scene was too familiar. It was as though the years had rolled backward, placing him once again in that humiliating spotlight. He remembered the heat of embarrassment, the burn of eyes watching him, the helplessness of realizing he couldn't afford what he needed. He could almost hear the cashier from years ago. "Your card has been declined." And just as quickly, he heard her voice too, the woman who had saved him. "It's all right. I've got this." That vow he had carried for so long suddenly rose to the surface. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The old woman pushed the bag of rice to the side, her voice breaking slightly. "I'll just take these instead." Before she could finish, he stepped forward. His voice was steady, though his heart raced. "Don't worry about it. I'll cover the rest." The cashier glanced up, startled. The woman turned, her eyes wide in confusion. No, you don't have to." But he shook his head firmly. "I want to." The cashier hesitated, then continued ringing the items. He slipped his card into the reader, the beep sounding louder than usual in his ears. The total cleared. The bags were packed. Just like that, it was done. The woman stared at him. Her lips parted as though she couldn't find words. Her hands trembled as she tried to gather her things. "Why would you? You don't even know me." He smiled, a quiet smile filled with recognition of how deeply he understood her position. "Someone once did the same for me," he said softly. "I never forgot it. And now, it's my turn." She blinked, her eyes wet. For a long moment, she just looked at him, as though trying to place him. And then something shifted in her expression, a flicker of recognition sparking where confusion had been. He froze, his own breath catching in his throat. Because in that moment, as her gaze locked on his, he realized she wasn't just a stranger. She was the woman, the one who had stepped forward all those years ago. And the past he had carried like a promise suddenly stood face to face with him in the present. The moment hung in the air heavier than the bags of groceries sitting on the counter. He stared at her, stunned, while she clutched the edge of the cart as if trying to steady herself. The years had aged her hair thinner, her frame smaller, but her eyes carried the same calm he remembered, the same eyes that had looked at him once before in his darkest moment. He had replayed that day in his mind countless times, always picturing her as a nameless stranger. Yet here she was, standing only inches away, struggling in the same checkout line where their paths had once crossed. He felt a chill run through him, the weight of the coincidence almost too much to grasp. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "It's you," she whispered, her eyes searching his face as though confirming what she already knew. "You were the young man." He nodded slowly, his throat tight. "Yes. That day, I never forgot." The cashier glanced between them, clearly confused but keeping quiet. The line behind them shifted impatiently, but neither of them seemed to notice. The woman's lips trembled into a smile. "I didn't think you'd remember me." It was so long ago. "How could I forget?" he said firmly. "You stepped in when no one else would. You gave me more than groceries that day. You gave me dignity when I didn't have any left." Tears welled in her eyes. She reached for the small bag the cashier had set aside, the rice she had tried to return, and pressed it close to her chest. "And now here you are, doing the same for me." He swallowed hard, his chest tightening. "I promised myself that if I ever had the chance, I would do what you did. I didn't think it would be for you. I didn't think I'd ever see you again." The old woman shook her head slowly, almost in disbelief. "Life has a strange way of circling back, doesn't it?" He helped her gather the rest of her bags, sliding them carefully into her cart. "You don't know how much that moment shaped me," he continued. "It made me want to work harder, to be better, to carry that kindness forward. I'm standing where I am today because of what you did." Her hands shook as she reached for his arm, squeezing gently. "I was just trying to help someone who needed it. I didn't expect it to come back around." "That's what makes it so powerful," he said softly. The people in line were restless now, shifting and sighing, but the world around them seemed muted. For the two of them, it was as if time had stopped, folding years of distance into a single shared moment. As they walked together toward the exit, he pushed her cart for her. The automatic doors opened, and the cool air brushed over them. She paused just outside, turning to him with tears still shimmering in her eyes. "You've reminded me of something," she said quietly. "That kindness isn't wasted. Even when you never see where it goes, it matters. I needed to remember that today." He smiled, though his own eyes burned. "And you reminded me of the same thing years ago. We're even now." She chuckled softly, shaking her head. "No, we're connected. That's different." They stood there a moment longer, neither rushing to leave. Finally, she reached into her bag, pulled out one of the apples she had bought, and handed it to him. "Take this. Not because you need it, but so you'll remember today the way you remembered back then." He accepted it carefully, the fruit warm from her hands. "I won't forget," he said. As she walked away, pushing her cart slowly across the parking lot, he stood holding that apple, overwhelmed by the full circle they had just completed. Years of silent gratitude had led him here. He had kept his vow. And in doing so, he had discovered that kindness has a way of returning when you least expect it, carrying with it the weight of a promise fulfilled. They stood just outside the automatic doors of the grocery store, caught between the noise of carts clattering over pavement and the quiet of their shared recognition. The apple she had given him was still warm in his hand, but the truth of what had just happened was even warmer, almost overwhelming. Neither of them moved at first. She leaned slightly on her cart, her shoulders small under the weight of years, and he stood tall beside her, no longer the embarrassed young man she once helped, but still carrying the same gratitude. For a long time, neither spoke. It was as though words might break the fragile miracle that had just unfolded. Finally, she let out a shaky laugh. "You know, when I saw you standing there today, I thought you looked familiar. But I never expected this." He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "I never expected to find you again either. Honestly, I thought you'd always just be a memory, a nameless stranger I'd carry with me." Her eyes softened, their edges glistening with tears. And instead, here we are. Both of us in the same place, all these years later. The hum of cars in the parking lot surrounded them, but for him, everything else faded. He thought of the countless times he'd replayed that day in his head, the countless times he'd promised himself that one day he would do what she had done. And now, against every odd, the very person who had sparked that vow was the one he had been able to repay. "I've thought about you more times than I can count," he admitted, his voice low but steady. "That day, it changed me. You probably don't even know how much it meant, but it pushed me forward when I could have fallen apart." She reached for his arm, her grip frail but full of strength in its own way. "I never thought something so small could ripple out like that. I just wanted to make sure you got home with food in your hands. That was all." "But it was more than food," he said quickly. "It was dignity. It was hope. And that's something I carried with me. Every step, every struggle, it was tied to what you did. You gave me the belief that people still cared. Her lips trembled into a smile, and she looked down briefly, blinking back tears. And now you've given it back. Full circle. They walked slowly toward her car, the cart rattling slightly on uneven pavement. He loaded her bags into the trunk for her, careful with each one, as if they held something more fragile than groceries. When he was done, she closed the trunk and stood facing him. Maybe we were meant to meet again, she said softly. Not by chance. Not just coincidence. Maybe life wanted us both to remember that kindness doesn't disappear. It just waits to come back around. He nodded, his throat tightening. I think you're right. I think we were meant to be here, today, like this. For a moment, neither said anything. The air between them was heavy with unspoken understanding. They were not just two people connected by chance. They were living proof of a truth most people forget, that even the smallest act can echo across years, across lives, until it returns like a gift. She reached out again, her hand resting briefly over his. Thank you, she whispered. He shook his head gently. No, thank you, for everything. For that day, for this day, for reminding me what kindness really means. Her smile lingered as she stepped into her car, giving him one last look before closing the door. He stood there in the parking lot as she drove away, the apple still in his hand, the weight of the moment pressing deep into his chest. The world around him resumed its normal pace, cars honking, carts rolling, doors sliding open and shut. But inside, he knew nothing would ever feel quite the same again. The drive back home felt different that day. He held the apple on the passenger seat as if it were something priceless, glancing at it every few minutes like proof the encounter had really happened. He kept replaying her face in his mind, the look of recognition, the tears in her eyes, the way she whispered, "It's you." For years, he had carried her kindness as a memory, a source of strength. Now it wasn't just a memory anymore. It had become real again. The circle had closed. When he reached his apartment, he placed the apple on the counter and sat down at the table. The room felt too quiet, too ordinary compared to the weight of what he had just experienced. He stared at the apple, and in it he saw both of them, the young man he once was, and the woman who had carried him through his shame with one simple act. That night, he called a close friend and told the story. His voice shook as he explained how he had finally kept the vow he'd made years ago. The friend listened quietly, then said something that stuck with him. You know, most people don't get that kind of closure. Most people never meet the ones they helped again. You've been given something rare. He thought about that for a long time. It was true. The world was full of small kindnesses that went unseen, unacknowledged. People helped one another every day without ever knowing the ripples they created. And yet somehow, he had been given the chance to see those ripples come back around. The next morning, he carried that thought with him to work. He looked at his co-workers differently, noticing the stress on their faces, the way some of them carried unspoken burdens. He found himself offering to cover small tasks, lending a listening ear, even just holding the door longer than usual. None of it was grand, but it reminded him that kindness wasn't about scale. It was about willingness. Later that week, he went back to the grocery store. This time, as he pushed his cart through the aisles, he wasn't looking for her. He knew the odds of seeing her again were slim, and maybe that was all right. What mattered wasn't finding her again. What mattered was carrying forward what she had given him. quiet generosity without expectation. At the register, he noticed a young man counting coins nervously. His total was just a few dollars more than he had. The cashier waited patiently, but the boy's ears turned red as he tried to decide which items to put back. Without hesitation, he stepped forward. "Don't worry about it," he said, just as she once had. "I've got this." The boy looked up, startled. "Really?" He nodded, sliding his card into the machine. "Really?" When the groceries were bagged, the boy muttered a shy thank you before hurrying out. He didn't ask his name. He didn't need it. The gesture was enough. Walking out of the store, he felt something shift inside him again. Helping her had completed a circle, but helping others kept it alive. It wasn't about closure anymore. It was about continuation. That night, as he bit into the apple she had given him, he thought of her words. "No. We're connected." She had been right. They were connected, not just to each other, but to everyone touched by acts of kindness that ripple across time, and with each person he helped, the circle widened. What had started years ago at a grocery store checkout line wasn't ending. It was only beginning. He often thought about how unlikely it all was, how a single moment in a grocery store had shaped the course of his life. One woman's quiet choice to help a stranger had set everything in motion, and years later, life had given him the chance to return it directly to her. That kind of full circle almost never happens, and yet it had happened to him. As the weeks passed, he realized something important. The story wasn't just about him and her. It wasn't just about groceries or embarrassment or even repayment. It was about what kindness does when it's let loose in the world. It moves. It travels. It grows. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it finds its way back to where it started. He kept her apple core, drying the seeds and planting them in a small pot on his windowsill. It might not grow into anything, but to him it was a symbol, a reminder that even the smallest seed can turn into something much bigger than itself. He watered it carefully, hoping it might sprout, but also knowing that whether it did or not, didn't change what it stood for. Every time he returned to the grocery store, he watched people a little differently, not out of pity, but out of recognition. He knew what it was like to stand frozen at the register, unsure of what would happen next, and he knew how much a stranger's hand could change everything. That awareness shaped how he lived. Sometimes it was paying for someone's groceries. Sometimes it was covering a bus fare. Sometimes it was nothing more than offering a kind word when someone looked like they were carrying the weight of the world. He didn't tell the story often, but when he did, people listened closely. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others smiled and said it gave them hope. And that was enough. If his story could remind even one person that kindness matters, then the circle kept expanding. He never saw her again after that day in the parking lot. But in a way, he didn't need to. She had been a stranger who became part of his story, and he had been the same for her. Their paths had crossed twice, once when he needed help, and once when she did. That was enough to prove what he had always hoped was true. Kindness never disappears. Sometimes he thought about what she had said. We're connected. He understood it better now. They weren't connected just by that one exchange, but by the bigger truth it represented. People are tied together through small acts, even when they don't know it. A gesture today might live inside someone for years, shaping choices they make long after. And so, whenever he reached into his wallet, whenever he saw someone struggling, whenever he felt the tug of hesitation, he reminded himself of that connection. He thought of her card sliding across the counter. He thought of her smile as she walked away. He thought of the apple she had pressed into his hand, and he chose, again and again, to keep the chain alive. Because in the end, that was the real lesson. Kindness doesn't just change the moment, it changes the future. It doesn't end with one person or one act. It keeps moving, like a story being told and retold through actions instead of words. His story began with shame, but it ended with gratitude. It began with a stranger's generosity, and it grew into a vow that lasted a lifetime. And if there was one thing he hoped others would take from it, it was this: you may never know the impact of your kindness. You may never see the ripples it creates. But one day, somewhere down the line, it may just come back to you in ways you could never imagine. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.